It was a crisp, sunny day when my phone vibrated violently on the metal cafe table, startling both me and Susan, my mother-in-law, from our peaceful lunch. Glancing at the screen, I saw Daniel's name flash across it, his photo popping up with an urgency that belied the calm atmosphere. Excusing myself, I answered, expecting perhaps some mundane question about evening plans or a gentle reminder about some household chore forgotten in the rush of daily life. "Mary, you're the reason Mom took her own life. I want a divorce right now." Daniel's voice thundered through the phone, each word a sledgehammer that left me dumbfounded. His accusation was not just outrageous, it was bizarre. "I'm having lunch with your mother right now, Daniel. What are you talking about?" I replied, my voice a mixture of shock and confusion. He spat out a curt, "What?" followed by a hasty goodbye, and the line went dead. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, the buzzing silence a stark contrast to the bombshell that had just been dropped on me. Turning back to Susan, who had observed the whole scene with a furrowed brow, I tried to offer a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "That was Daniel." "He seemed confused," I said, trying to downplay the severity of his words. Susan, her expression softening with concern, reached out to pat my hand. "What did he say, dear?" Reluctantly, I shared the contents of the call. As I spoke, Susan's features shifted from concern to incredulity. "That's impossible." "I'm right here, and very much alive," she joked weakly, trying to lighten the mood, but the worry lingered in her eyes. We decided to finish our meal, though the food now tasted bland, and our conversation, usually lively and filled with laughter, was subdued. As we sipped our coffee, my mind raced. Daniel's behavior had been increasingly erratic, but this outright delusion was new territory. I recalled the past months where Daniel had grown more distant, his temper short and his demands absurd. He had insisted I quit my job, claiming it made him look incompetent as a provider. Yet, it was his pride that seemed to dwarf his sense of reality. Susan, ever the peacemaker, had supported my decision to work from home, recognizing my need to feel productive and independent. Our chat at the cafe shifted to more serious topics, with Susan confiding her concerns about Daniel's requests for money under the pretense of business needs. Her suspicions about the health of his company added another layer of anxiety to my already troubled thoughts. "He's always been prideful, Mary. He wouldn't admit if things were failing until it might be too late," she sighed, a sad frown lining her face. As we parted ways, Susan's troubles and the strange call from Daniel weighed heavily on my mind. I knew I needed to confront him, to unearth the root of his delusions and address his deteriorating behavior. As I drove home, my resolve hardened. No matter the challenges, I would stand by Susan and face whatever storm was brewing with Daniel head-on. I gathered all my courage to confront Daniel about everything that was unsettling me, from the inexplicable accusations to the distressing changes in his behavior. The tension between us had been mounting, his outbursts becoming more frequent and more volatile. The once sweet scent of his cologne, which had now turned into an unfamiliar perfume wafting through our home, seemed like a taunt each time he passed by. On that particular evening, when he returned home unusually late again, I decided it was time to address everything. The living room was quiet, the only sound was the ticking of the clock, amplifying the gravity of the moment as I waited for him to settle in. As soon as he dropped his keys on the table, I spoke up. "Daniel, we need to talk about the changes I've been noticing in you. What's going on?" I tried to keep my voice calm, but my nerves were frayed. He barely glanced my way, shrugging off his coat with a grunt. "What changes?" "You're imagining things." I pressed on, undeterred. "It's not just in my head. You've been coming home late, you've switched perfumes, and you've been dismissive of not just me, but Susan as well. Plus, this talk of needing money and lashing out, it's not like you." Daniel scoffed, avoiding my gaze. "I don't have time for this nonsense. You're always making a big deal out of nothing." He tried to walk past me to the bedroom, but I stood my ground. "And the perfume? It's definitely not yours, and I've noticed it's a woman's scent. You've never worn anything like it before," I continued, my voice a mix of hurt and accusation. He stopped in his tracks, his back still turned to me. You're being paranoid. It's just a new brand, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. I found no bottle in your room, Daniel. And then there's the rotten food you said was from your mother. It's clear it wasn't a mistake. Are you trying to hurt me on purpose? My voice broke, the strain of the past months catching up to me. Daniel turned sharply, his expression a mix of anger and something else, guilt, perhaps? You're blowing things out of proportion. I'm just under a lot of stress. The company is struggling, and my mother, she has her own issues. But why lie about Susan and try to turn me against her? And why the secrecy and late nights? I persisted, desperate for the truth. He sighed heavily, running his hands through his hair. Look, maybe I've been out of line a bit. But you don't understand the pressure I'm under. As for Susan, that's just how things are. Mothers and daughters-in-law aren't meant to be friends. That's not true. Susan and I have a great relationship, despite what you've been implying, I countered, feeling a mix of anger and sorrow. I think there's more you're not telling me. Daniel looked away, his posture deflating. He didn't respond, his silence more telling than words. I knew then that our problems ran deeper than mere stress or misunderstandings. As he walked away from me that evening, the mysterious perfume lingering in the air, I realized that resolving our issues would be far more complicated than I had hoped. The gap between us had widened into a chasm, filled with secrets and lies, and I was left standing alone, wondering how we had ever come to this point. Deciding to take matters into my own hands, I met Susan the following day. We chose a quiet restaurant with private rooms, ideal for discussing sensitive matters without the fear of being overheard. My heart was heavy with anxiety as I sat across from Susan, who looked equally concerned. Mary, I'm glad you called. I was beginning to worry we might never sort this out, Susan started, her voice shaky. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and dread. Susan, there's something important we need to address. Daniel told me that you were unhappy with me, that you thought I was speaking ill of you. But I never believed it, I confessed, watching her reaction closely. Susan's eyes widened in surprise. Oh, Mary, no. I never said such things. I thought it was you who had issues with me. Daniel told me you wanted space from me, that you felt I was too controlling. It was clear then, Daniel had been manipulating us both, feeding lies to create a rift in our once strong relationship. The realization was like a punch to the gut, but also a call to unite against the deceit. And about the rotten perishables he said you sent, that was a lie too, wasn't it? I asked, needing to hear it from her directly. Susan looked confused for a moment before her expression turned to one of indignation. Absolutely not. I would never send such a thing. It seems Daniel has been playing us both for some reason. As we were piecing together Daniel's deceit over our lunch, my phone rang loudly, cutting through the tense atmosphere. It was Daniel. Excusing myself, I stepped outside to take the call. His voice boomed through the phone, full of irrational accusations and demands for a divorce, claiming I had pushed his mother to take her own life. Actually, I'm having lunch with your mother right now, I countered, struggling to maintain my composure. There was a pause on the line, and then a click. Daniel had hung up, stunned. Returning to the table, I relayed the bizarre accusation to Susan, who shook her head in disbelief. Moments later, her phone rang. It was Daniel again. With a knowing look, Susan switched her phone to speaker mode, allowing me to hear the conversation. Mom, are you with someone right now? Daniel's voice was cautious, probing. Susan winked at me before replying, Oh, I'm just out shopping with a friend. Is something wrong? On the other end, Daniel muttered under his breath, calling Susan a liar, and then loudly accused me of cheating and declared his intent to divorce me, urging Susan never to trust me again. Susan, maintaining her calm demeanor, continued to engage Daniel, drawing out his motives and contradictions. Once the call ended, Susan looked at me with a mix of anger and determination. Let's teach that man a lesson together, she said, her voice firm and resolute. Filled with a newfound alliance and determination, I drove home, where I found Daniel waiting. His attempt to appear calm was almost comical, given the tension he exuded. Today, I decided, was the day I would confront him about everything, armed with the truth and Susan by my side, even if just in spirit. As I entered the house, I braced myself for the conversation that would inevitably change the course of our lives. I was still reeling from the shock of Daniel's blatant dishonesty as I approached him in our living room, where he was now seated awkwardly across from Susan and Emily, his face a mask of fear. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could tell from his posture that he realized his scheme was unraveling quickly. "Daniel, every time you came home, you smelled of perfume. Did you not think I'd notice? Or is there something wrong with your nose?" My voice was calm but carried a sharp edge, slicing through the silence that had fallen over the room. I continued, my voice steady. Tired of feeling uneasy, I decided to investigate. Disguising my appearance, I followed you and your mistress to a hotel and captured the moment you both entered. How did you find her contact information so meticulously hidden on your locked phone? You thought fingerprint recognition was foolproof, but that's easy to bypass when you're asleep. Susan, who was usually calm and gentle, now echoed my stern tone, her voice firm as she silenced her son with a simple command to be quiet. "So, I contacted Emily," I revealed, noting the surprised flicker across Daniel's face as I confessed to orchestrating this confrontation with Susan's help. Forcing Daniel's chin up as he kept his head bowed in shame, I compelled him to meet my eyes. "You've mentioned your intentions over the phone to Susan, but could you share them with me too?" My words were polite, but the underlying accusation was clear. Reluctantly, Daniel began to explain. "I plan to divorce you, take the alimony and shared property, and then remarry Emily. Initially, I intended to make it look like Susan took her own life and blame you for it, leading to our divorce." His confession was met with silence, the gravity of his deceit settling like dust after a storm. "It's surprising you thought such a lie about Susan's death would work. I guess you were that into your mistress," I said, my tone dry and incredulous. As I spoke, I could see the realization of his unraveling plans dawning on him, his schemes laid bare and his options dwindling. But when I told him, I paused, looking between Susan and Emily, who was quietly observing, likely overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation she had been dragged into. "When I told him I was having lunch with Susan, your entire plot fell apart, didn't it?" Daniel nodded, small, defeated movements that confirmed his guilt. The room was heavy with the weight of his betrayal, the broken trust palpable. Susan, regaining some of her composure, added, "We need to think about the next steps carefully." Her gaze shifted between me and Daniel, a mixture of sorrow and resolve in her eyes. I looked at Daniel, then at Emily, who seemed uncertain and afraid. It was clear that any decisions made today would alter the course of several lives. But for now, the truth was out, and with it, the opportunity to start rectifying the damage caused by deceit and manipulation. The conversation was far from over, and the path to resolution was unclear, but at least now, everything was in the open. As Daniel's myriad of lies continued to unravel, the weight of his deceptions became painfully clear. There in Susan's living room, under the scrutiny of those he had wronged, he seemed smaller, his usual bravado gone. After confronting him with the truth about his affair and his schemes, I could hardly bear to look at him. His next actions, however, were entirely predictable. Susan, having maintained her composure thus far, finally broke her silence with a heavy sigh. "Daniel, I never thought you could be so selfish. I'll end it here. I'm cutting off your financial support." Her voice was calm, but carried a finality that seemed to echo around the room. Daniel's face drained of color. "You're kidding, right?" he stammered, disbelief etched across his features. "Actually," Susan continued, her tone firm, "I've been financially supporting your company. And after becoming suspicious of your constant requests for money, I discovered you were using the funds for your mistress, not for the business needs you claimed." The disappointment in her eyes was palpable. "I no longer consider you my son. I'm disowning you. So leave this house." The reality of his situation finally seemed to hit Daniel. The house, indeed, was in Susan's name, and without her financial and emotional support, he was left with nothing. He turned his panicked gaze towards me, perhaps hoping for a flicker of sympathy or a hint of the partnership we once had. Instead, I slid the divorce papers across the table towards him. "Sign here, please. Here's a pen. Enjoy your life with your mistress as much as you want. At least let me off the compensation money," he pleaded weakly, the desperation in his voice clear. "Don't joke with me. How dare you claim Susan took her own life?" My response was cold, my hand firm as I slapped his face, the sound echoing in the room. His mistress, Emily, suddenly spoke up, her voice tinged with bitterness. "What if there's no money? There's no benefit to marrying an old man like you," she said, slapping him as well. The double shock caused Daniel to collapse to the floor, tears streaming down his face. Turning to Emily, I said sternly, "By the way, Emily, I'll be seeking compensation from you too." "Why me?" "You can't just meddle with someone's husband and get away scot-free," I declared, my tone leaving no room for argument. Overwhelmed and powerless, Emily too slumped to the floor, her defiance crumbling as the reality of her actions set in. Together, Susan and I made the decision to remove both Daniel and Emily from the house. After finalizing the divorce, I pursued legal action to secure $220,000 in compensation for the turmoil and betrayal Daniel had caused. It was a harsh but necessary conclusion to a chapter of my life, defined by deception and manipulation. With Susan's support, I was determined to rebuild and move forward, no longer overshadowed by Daniel's selfish schemes. Elizabeth's delicate fingers would often pause over objects, a distant look in her eyes, as if each item whispered secrets of the past she yearned to understand. During these times, I watched her closely, a sense of unease gnawing at me. There was a depth to her sadness that seemed tethered not just to the loss of family members, but to something unspoken, a hidden grief that she carried alone. One afternoon, as we sifted through old photographs and letters in the attic, Elizabeth suddenly held up a small, sealed envelope. "Jessica, I found this tucked away behind some old files," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's addressed to me, but I've never seen it before." Her hands shook as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from our mother-in-law, written in her unmistakable, flowing script, which was strange, considering her last will had been typed. Elizabeth read the letter silently, her eyes widening with every line. She passed it to me, her hands now visibly shaking. "Read this, Jessica. It's shocking." Taking the letter, I read through the beautifully scripted lines. The letter detailed a confession that our mother-in-law had been deeply unhappy, not because of her husband's passing, but due to a profound isolation and misunderstanding by those closest to her. She wrote of secret grievances and undisclosed pains that seemed to have been too great to bear alone. Yet, it was the ending that chilled me the most. She mentioned being coerced into taking medication that she didn't need, medication that ultimately led to her overdose. This can't be," I stuttered, feeling a cold dread settle over me. Could someone have manipulated her into ending her own life? The idea was monstrous, unthinkable. Elizabeth nodded grimly. "I've been feeling something was off ever since Dad passed. Mom wasn't just grieving, she seemed scared. We decided to keep the discovery between us until we could gather more evidence. Over the next few weeks, we embarked on a quiet investigation, piecing together the events leading up to our mother-in-law's death. It became increasingly clear that there were discrepancies in the story we had been told. Medication that should have been securely locked away was found misplaced, and there were unfamiliar footprints in the private areas of the clinic. Then, the letter from Elizabeth arrived a week after her tragic death, urging me to report everything to the police. My hands trembled with a mix of sorrow and fury as I held the letter. Elizabeth had known something was terribly wrong, and now it was up to me to bring this hidden darkness into the light. "Paul," I said one evening as we sat in the quiet of our living room, the letter lying heavily between us. "We need to talk about your mother, and about Elizabeth. There's something very wrong with how things happened." Paul looked at me, confusion and concern etching his face. What do you mean, Jessica? Taking a deep breath, I began to unravel the story, each word heavier than the last, determined to seek justice for the hidden pains and silent screams that had gone unheard in our family for too long. Paul arrived home unexpectedly early, his face shadowed with concern, or perhaps it was guilt. I confronted him immediately, holding the letter from Elizabeth in my hands. Paul, we need to talk. Elizabeth sent me this letter before she died, and it's urgent. She said she's going to be erased soon and urged me to report to the police immediately. What is happening here? Do you know something about this? Paul's expression darkened, and he sank into the nearest chair, a deep sigh escaping him. I can't believe she actually sent it, he muttered more to himself than to me. Sent what, Paul? What do you know about Elizabeth's and your mother's deaths? My voice was firm, demanding answers. Paul ran his hands through his hair, looking trapped. It's complicated, Jessica. There's a lot you don't understand. It's not just about what happened to Mom and Elizabeth. It's bigger than that. His vague answers only fueled my frustration. And fear. I'm going to the police, Paul. Whatever this is, it's too big for us to handle alone. Elizabeth was scared, I can see that now, and I think you're scared too. Paul nodded slowly, resigned. Okay. Maybe it's time everything came out. But please, let's talk first. There are things you need to know before you go to the police. His solemn tone gave me pause. I agreed, sitting down opposite him as he began to unravel the tangled threads of our family's dark secrets. He spoke of financial troubles, hidden debts, and questionable dealings that went far beyond the simple inheritance issues I had suspected. There were layers of deception involving people outside the family, dangerous people with much to lose. After our long discussion, I felt overwhelmed but more determined than ever to uncover the truth. Paul's revelations explained some of the mystery, but the direct cause of Elizabeth's and his mother's deaths remained unclear. He admitted to his erratic behavior being a result of his desperate attempts to keep these problems from me, to protect me from the darker aspects of his family's affairs. With my emotions a whirlwind of anger, sorrow, and determination, I took the letter and drove to the police station. There, I handed over the letter and recounted everything Paul had told me, along with my own suspicions and fears. The police were attentive, taking detailed notes and assuring me they would investigate thoroughly. Returning home, I found an atmosphere of tense anticipation. Paul sat quietly in the living room, waiting for me. Our eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of the storm we were about to face together. In the days that followed, while waiting for the police to move forward with their investigation, I couldn't help but reflect on the chain of events that had led to this moment. I felt a mix of fear and relief, knowing that whatever the outcome, the truth was finally emerging. I also sent a discreet letter to a trusted friend, someone outside the immediate chaos, detailing everything in case something happened to me. It was a precaution, a way of ensuring that no matter what, the truth wouldn't be buried. 2 nights later, as Paul and I sat in our quiet home, there was a knock on the door. The time had come to face whatever consequences our actions had invited. I steeled myself, ready to confront whatever or whoever was waiting on the other side. That's why she left the note for me. To continue digging after her own suspicions led her to believe you were behind both your mother's and eventually her own tragic end. Paul stood there, his face a mix of defiance. You think you've figured it all out, don't you? Just because of some letters and a diary? You're turning into a detective over some paranoid fantasies. I shook my head, my resolve hardening. It's not just paranoia. Elizabeth trusted me, she was reaching out for help. Why would she lie in her final message? And why were you here, in her room, in the dark, if not to find and destroy whatever you feared she had left behind? Paul's demeanor shifted as he realized the extent of my investigations and the trap I had laid with the fake letter. His initial shock gave way to a calculated calmness. All right, Jessica. You caught me here, but think about what you're accusing me of. Do you really believe I could harm my own family? I met his gaze steadily. I don't want to believe it, Paul, but everything points to it. The diary, Elizabeth's actions, your secretive behavior. You were scared enough to come here tonight to search her room. If you're innocent, why not let the evidence speak for itself? Seeing his reaction, I continued, we're going to the police, Paul. They will investigate all of this, Elizabeth's note, your mother's diary, and your presence here tonight. We need the truth to come out, for the sake of everyone involved. Paul's shoulders slumped as the reality of the situation seemed to sink in. He knew there was no escaping the scrutiny that would follow. Okay, Jessica. Let's go to the police. If that's what it takes to clear all this up, let's do it. Together, we left the room, and I carefully gathered the diary, the letters, and other potential evidence. As we drove to the police station, the silence between us was heavy, filled with the weight of pending revelations and the potential unraveling of the life we had built together. At the police station, I presented everything to the detectives, who listened intently and assured us they would conduct a thorough investigation. As they took Paul aside for questioning, I sat in the waiting area, my mind racing with the implications of what was unfolding. I had stepped into this investigation as a concerned sister-in-law, but now I was potentially exposing my husband as a criminal. The complexity of my emotions was overwhelming: betrayal, fear, sadness, and a fierce desire for justice. As I waited for the police to finish their initial questioning, I realized that no matter the outcome, our lives would never be the same. Staring down at Paul as he sat there, his head bowed and tears streaming down his face, I felt a mix of anger and pity. The man I had married, the one I thought I knew, had unraveled before my eyes, revealed as someone far more duplicitous and morally bankrupt than I could have imagined. How dare you act like this in front of me? I spat the words out, my voice thick with emotion. After everything you've done, you sit here crying over an affair? What about your mother? What about Elizabeth? Paul wiped his face, looking up at me with a mixture of shame and desperation. I didn't want any of this to happen. It just got out of control. Out of control? I echoed incredulously. Paul, you made choices. You chose to start an affair. You chose to squander money. And worst of all, it seems like you chose actions that led to the deaths of your own family members. Whether you directly caused their deaths or just set the circumstances, you bear responsibility. Paul remained silent, his shoulders slumped, the fight seemingly drained out of him. It was clear that whatever defenses he might have tried to mount were crumbling in the face of his own guilt and the evidence I had gathered. I continued, my voice steadier as I regained control over my emotions. I went to the club and met Nancy. She told me everything, Paul. How you pursued her, showered her with gifts, all while our family was falling apart. She's cutting ties with you, and frankly, I am too. The realization of losing Nancy seemed to hit him harder than anything else, a testament to how far he had strayed from the man I thought I had married. But it wasn't just about an illicit affair or financial imprudence anymore. There were 2 deaths in our family that needed answers, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. I'm going to the police with all of this, I declared, my decision firm. The coffee you just tried to give me, the affair, the financial issues, and everything else. It's clear you're not just a cheating husband but a dangerous one. Paul looked up, fear creeping into his eyes. Jessica, please, let's talk about this. We can sort it out. No, Paul. We're past talking. You've crossed lines that can't be uncrossed, I said resolutely. I had always believed in justice and the truth, and now more than ever, I needed to uphold those principles, not just for myself but for Elizabeth and my mother-in-law. Turning away from him, I gathered the documents, the credit card statements, Nancy's business card, and the diary entries. With every step I took towards the door, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders, not because the journey ahead would be easy, but because I was finally taking steps towards truth and justice. As I left the house to go to the police station, I didn't look back. The future was uncertain, and I knew the road to resolving this would be fraught with challenges, but I was ready to face whatever came, armed with truth and a resolve to see justice served. Starting over hasn't been easy, but every day feels like a step forward from the shadows that once engulfed my existence. I find solace in my work and the new beginnings it represents. The weight of the past, though never fully gone, begins to lift, allowing me to breathe a little easier with each passing day. In the wake of everything that has happened, I've taken to spending my evenings walking through the park near my new home, reflecting on the tumultuous events that upended my life. It's during these quiet moments that I process everything: my failed marriage, the deceit, the danger, and ultimately, the liberation from an unknowingly oppressive situation with Paul. The community around me has been incredibly supportive. My colleagues, who knew only fragments of my personal turmoil, have shown great kindness, easing my transition back into a normal routine. I've even started attending a local support group for individuals who have experienced similar betrayals and losses. It's there that I've met others who understand the complexities of trusting and healing after such deep betrayal. One evening, after a particularly cathartic group meeting, I received a call from Richard. He had been a cornerstone during the most challenging moments, and his voice was a welcome sound. "Jessica, just checking in to see how you're holding up," he said, his tone warm and genuinely concerned. "I'm managing, Richard. Actually, some days are better than others, but today was a good day," I replied, the smile audible in my voice. "That's great to hear, Jessica. And I've been thinking a lot about what happened and everything we went through. I'm planning to start a community program to help people who find themselves manipulated by loved ones. I believe our experiences could really benefit others." His proposal struck a chord with me. "That sounds amazing, Richard. It's so important to turn our experiences into something positive." "Count me in," I said, feeling a spark of purpose ignite within me. As I continued my evening walk, I thought about how life's trials had led me to this moment of reflection and newfound resolve. The pain had been transformative, forcing me to grow in ways I never expected. I was not just surviving, I was thriving, building a future on my terms, grounded in my values and experiences. Reaching my new home, I paused at the door, taking a deep breath of the crisp evening air. Inside, my living space was still a work in progress, much like myself. Each piece of furniture, each decoration was a choice that reflected my new path. Settling down for the night, I felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold its challenges, but for the first time in a long while, I was eager to meet them head-on, strengthened by my past and hopeful for my future. With every challenge overcome, I felt more fulfilled, confident in my resilience and in the new